What if every U.S. state became its own country?
California would become the world's fifth largest economy overnight. Texas would control more oil than Norway. And Florida? Florida would instantly become one of the most strategically important nations on Earth, sitting on shipping lanes that carry 40% of America's imports. But here's what nobody talks about. 27 states would immediately face economic collapse. They quite literally cannot survive on their own. Their economies are so dependent on federal money that independence would mean bankruptcy within months. And that's just the beginning, because when you actually break down what happens when the United States splits into 50 separate countries, you discover something absolutely terrifying. The global power vacuum would be so catastrophic that it would make the fall of the Soviet Union look like a minor inconvenience. China would move on Taiwan within weeks, Russia would swallow Eastern Europe, and the American states themselves, they'd be at each other's throats within a year, fighting over water rights, trade routes, and resources that were never meant to be divided.
The moment the United States officially dissolves, Wall Street crashes. Not a correction, not a bear market, a complete systemic collapse that makes 2008 look like a warm-up. Because here's what most people don't understand about the American economy. It's not 50 separate economies loosely connected. It's one massive, intricately woven system where California's tech sector depends on Texas oil, which depends on Midwest agriculture, which depends on East Coast finance. The dollar, which has been the world's reserve currency since 1944, loses that status within hours. 80 years of global financial architecture disappears overnight. Countries holding U.S. debt, we're talking about trillions of dollars, suddenly hold paper from a nation that no longer exists. Japan, China, the United Kingdom, they're all sitting on worthless bonds. But the real chaos starts in the states themselves. Colorado cuts off water to Arizona, California, and Nevada. Why? Because the Colorado River, which supplies water to 40 million people, starts in the Rocky Mountains, and Colorado, now a sovereign nation, realizes it holds all the cards. Arizona's population of 7 million people suddenly faces a water crisis that makes Mad Max look optimistic. Meanwhile, the power grid collapses. See, America's electrical system isn't designed for borders. Texas has its own grid, sure, but the eastern and western interconnections span multiple states. When those states become countries with customs, tariffs, and potentially hostile relationships, the grid can't function. California experiences rolling blackouts. New York loses power for days. And transportation? The interstate highway system, built as a unified federal project, now crosses 49 international borders. Truckers need passports, visas, and customs clearance to deliver goods. A shipment from Los Angeles to New York that once took 3 days now takes 3 weeks. Supply chains don't just break, they completely disintegrate. Within 72 hours, grocery store shelves in 30 states are empty. Not low, empty. Because modern just-in-time logistics depends on seamless, borderless transportation. Gas stations run dry. Hospitals can't get medical supplies. The pharmaceutical supply chain, which depends on ingredients crossing multiple state lines, grinds to a halt. But we're just getting started, because the economic devastation is only the opening act.
The United States military is the most powerful fighting force in human history. $700 billion a year, 11 aircraft carriers, 5,000 nuclear warheads, bases in 80 countries around the world. The moment America splits, that power doesn't just diminish, it completely evaporates. Here's why. Military power isn't about having guns and planes. It's about logistics, supply chains, industrial capacity, and economic power to sustain operations. The U.S. military depends on components manufactured in 40 different states. An F-35 fighter jet has parts made in 45 states. When those states become separate countries with competing interests, you can't build jets anymore. Nuclear weapons? The government tries to secure them, but now you've got former states arguing over who gets what. Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming host most of America's land-based nuclear missiles. Do they just hand those over? To whom? What if they decide to keep them? And the aircraft carriers, those 11 symbols of American power projection? They're based in Virginia, California, Washington, and Florida. 4 different countries now own the world's most powerful naval assets, except none of them can operate a carrier group alone. It takes 10,000 personnel, support ships, aircraft, and billions in maintenance. Virginia can't afford to run a carrier battle group on its own economy. So within months, the carrier groups are sold off. China buys 2, Russia gets 1. Japan, nervous about Chinese expansion, desperately purchases 1. The European Union tries to keep 1 but can't afford the operational costs. American global military presence collapses overnight. The 500 overseas military bases? Gone. Every country demands they leave because there's no United States to negotiate with anymore. Should they report to Texas, California, New York? And that's when the wolves smell blood. China launches its invasion of Taiwan within 2 weeks. Why wait? The American security guarantee that prevented this for 70 years doesn't exist anymore. The Pacific Fleet is split between California, Washington, and Hawaii, 3 countries that can't even agree on trade policy, let alone a coordinated military response. Russia moves into the Baltics. NATO invokes Article 5, the Collective Defense Agreement, but there's no America to respond. Europe suddenly realizes that its entire security framework was built on American military might. France and the UK have nuclear weapons, sure, but conventional forces? They can't stop a Russian advance without American logistics, intelligence, and firepower. The Middle East explodes into open warfare. Iran, no longer constrained by American presence, moves on Saudi Arabia. Israel faces existential threats from multiple directions. Oil prices don't just spike, they quintuple. Global economy slides into depression. But here's where it gets really dark. Former American states start fighting each other.
Let's talk about something nobody wants to discuss. Resource conflicts between former states would be inevitable, and the deadliest would be over water. The Colorado River supplies water to 7 states. When those become 7 countries, you've got a catastrophic problem. The river starts in Colorado, flows through Utah, touches Wyoming, crosses Arizona, forms the border between Nevada and Arizona, then between California and Arizona, before reaching Mexico. Under U.S. law, the Colorado River Compact of 1922 allocated water rights, but that's U.S. law. It doesn't exist anymore. Colorado, sitting at the source, does the math. They've got 7 million people and massive agricultural operations that need water. They also realize they're sitting on the most valuable resource in the Southwest, so they build dams, they divert water, they start selling water at premium prices to desperate states downstream. California, Arizona, and Nevada, now separate countries, have 2 choices: pay Colorado's prices or take the water by force. Arizona strikes first. They need to. Without Colorado River water, Phoenix, a city of 5 million people in the middle of a desert, becomes uninhabitable. So Arizona's new military, cobbled together from National Guard units, marches toward the Colorado border. Colorado appeals to its neighbors for help. Utah and New Mexico form a defensive alliance. Within months, you've got active warfare in the American Southwest over water rights. But the Colorado River isn't even the worst of it. The Great Lakes contain 21% of the world's surface fresh water. They're shared by 8 states: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. Add in the Canadian provinces, and you've got multiple countries claiming rights to the world's largest freshwater system. Illinois, with Chicago's 9 million people, takes aggressive action. They already have infrastructure reversing the Chicago River to pull water from Lake Michigan. Now, as an independent country, they massively expand this operation. Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, all dependent on stable lake levels, watch their shorelines recede. The Great Lakes War begins with economic sanctions, then blockades, then actual military engagement on the lakes themselves. Coast Guard cutters, now belonging to different countries, face off against each other. The Soo Locks, which allow ships to pass between Lake Superior and the lower Great Lakes, become the most contested strategic point in North America. Michigan controls them. Every other Great Lakes country needs them. The lock becomes the Suez Canal of the Midwest. And water isn't the only resource people will kill for. Texas sits on massive oil reserves. The Permian Basin produces 5 million barrels per day. Oklahoma has the Cushing Storage Facility, one of the world's most important oil hubs. Louisiana controls the refineries that turn crude oil into gasoline. These 3 states, now countries, form the backbone of North American energy. But here's the problem. Texas has the oil, Louisiana has the refineries, but they need pipelines crossing multiple countries to connect them. Each country demands transit fees. Prices explode. Texas, realizing it has leverage, starts making aggressive demands. Louisiana refuses. Oklahoma tries to play middleman but gets squeezed from both sides. Within a year, there are military skirmishes along the Texas-Louisiana border over pipeline access.
While former American states tear each other apart, some emerge as genuine regional powers, and the new hierarchy would surprise you. California becomes an instant superpower, GDP of $3.9 trillion. That's bigger than India, bigger than the UK. If California were a country today, it would be the world's 5th largest economy. It's got everything: tech industry, agriculture, entertainment, ports, natural resources. Silicon Valley alone generates more wealth than most countries. But California has a fatal weakness: water and energy. The state already imports massive amounts of both. Now it's importing them from foreign countries. Nevada controls Hoover Dam. Arizona could cut off Colorado River access. The Pacific Northwest has hydroelectric power California desperately needs. California does what every resource-hungry power in history has done. It starts making deals that look a lot like imperialism. Economic pressure on Nevada, trade agreements with Oregon that heavily favor California. Within 5 years, California effectively controls its neighbors through economic dependence. Texas becomes the oil empire. 29 million people, economy of $2.4 trillion. That's bigger than Russia's economy. Plus, Texas has oil, natural gas, agriculture, and a massive industrial base. It's got its own power grid, its own culture. Texans already act like they're their own country. Texas forms an alliance with Oklahoma and Louisiana, the oil triangle. Together, they control most of North America's energy production. They start selling oil at premium prices to former American states. When California complains, Texas shrugs. What's California going to do? Invade? California's military is tech-focused and scattered across multiple bases. Texas National Guard is 21,000 strong, and now it's a national army. But the real power play comes from an unexpected source: the Great Lakes Alliance. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania realize they share the world's largest freshwater system, significant manufacturing capacity, and agricultural production. Together, their combined economy is over $5 trillion. That's larger than Japan. They form a confederation. Think European Union, but actually functional because they share culture, language, and geographic proximity. Free trade, free movement, common currency. Within 3 years, the Great Lakes Alliance is the most stable, prosperous region of former America. They have what desperate southwestern states need: water. They have what everyone needs: manufacturing capacity. Suddenly, the Midwest, always overlooked, becomes the new center of North American power. Florida becomes something unexpected, a strategic military power. 11 million people isn't that impressive. Economy of 1.4 trillion is solid but not exceptional. But Florida's geography makes it invaluable. It controls access to the Gulf of Mexico. The Florida Straits between Florida and Cuba is one of the world's most important shipping lanes. 40% of America's imports used to pass through here. Now it's multiple countries' imports, and Florida controls the choke point. Florida starts charging hefty passage fees. Ships pay or go around, adding weeks to journeys. Gulf states like Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama need access. They pay. East Coast states need Gulf access. They pay. Florida becomes absurdly wealthy from geography alone. Cuba, seeing opportunity, allies with Florida. Together, they effectively control Caribbean access. Within 5 years, Florida-Cuba becomes a regional power that punches way above its weight. But while these new powers consolidate, something darker happens to the weaker states.
27 states receive more federal funding than they pay in taxes. They're subsidized by wealthier states. When America splits, that subsidy disappears overnight. The result? Immediate economic collapse. Mississippi has the lowest GDP per capita in America, $47,000. Its state government budget is 33% funded by federal money. When that money vanishes, Mississippi can't pay teachers, police, or maintain infrastructure. The government quite literally goes bankrupt. West Virginia is even worse, 40% federal funding. When that disappears, the state, now a country, has 2 options: massive tax increases or massive service cuts. They try both. The result is economic death spiral. Businesses leave. Tax revenue drops further. More cuts. More businesses leave. Within 2 years, Mississippi and West Virginia become failed states. Not hyperbole. Actual failed states by international definition. Government can't maintain monopoly on violence. Infrastructure crumbles. Basic services don't exist. But it's not just the obviously poor states. New Mexico, 47% federal funding. Kentucky, 43%. Alabama, 41%. These states depended on federal money for basic operations. Without it, they collapse. And they're not alone. Military bases pumped billions into local economies. When the military dissolves, bases close. Towns that existed because of Fort Bragg, Fort Hood, or Naval Station Norfolk become ghost towns overnight. The human suffering is catastrophic. Millions become refugees. They flee from collapsed states to stable ones. The Great Lakes Alliance builds a wall. Not metaphorical, an actual wall on its southern border to stop refugees from failed southern states. California, drowning in refugees from Arizona and Nevada, does the same. Oregon and Washington close borders to California refugees. Within 3 years, you've got refugee camps housing millions of former Americans, now stateless people whose countries collapsed. Diseases spread through these camps. Cholera, typhoid, diseases America hadn't seen in a century. Healthcare systems in stable states collapse under the weight. The refugee crisis makes the Syrian refugee situation look manageable. And then the cartels move in. Mexican drug organizations, already powerful, see opportunity. Failed states like New Mexico, Arizona border regions, and parts of Texas become cartel territory. They're better armed and better funded than collapsed state governments. Within 5 years, cartel-controlled territories stretch hundreds of miles into former America. But some states try a different approach to survival. When you can't survive alone, you find partners. Regional alliances form quickly, some out of genuine cooperation, others from pure desperation. New England federates almost immediately. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, they're small, they're close, they share culture and economy. Combined population, 15 million. Combined economy, 1.5 trillion. Not massive, but respectable. They call themselves the New England Federation, keep the dollar as currency, and essentially recreate America in miniature. The Federation works because these states always functioned as a unit anyway. Boston remains the hub. They've got excellent universities, tech sector, finance, healthcare. They're positioned perfectly on the Atlantic coast. Within 5 years, New England Federation is one of the most stable, prosperous nations in former America. The Southeast tries to follow this model. Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia form the Southeast Alliance. Combined population, 40 million. Combined economy, 3.2 trillion. On paper, it's a superpower, but it doesn't work. The states are too different. Virginia is educated and wealthy. North Carolina is split between urban prosperity and rural poverty. South Carolina and Tennessee are heavily dependent on disappeared federal funding. Georgia tries to lead, but nobody trusts Atlanta to run things. Within 3 years, the Southeast Alliance is falling apart. Virginia pulls out and joins the Mid-Atlantic Confederation with Maryland and D.C. The rest struggle on, but it's clearly failing. The most unexpected alliance forms in the Mountain West. Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah, the most independent anti-government states in America, realize they're landlocked, resource-rich, and surrounded by hungry neighbors. They formed the Mountain Confederation, a loose alliance focused on mutual defense and resource sharing. They've got minerals, oil, natural gas, agriculture, and they're sitting on most of former America's nuclear arsenal. Nobody wants to mess with the Mountain Confederation because nobody knows if they actually control those nukes or not. The ambiguity is the point. It keeps predatory neighbors at bay. But the darkest alliance forms in the South. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas are all collapsing. Federal money is gone. Economies are cratering. Governments are failing. In desperation, they formed the Southern Compact with one explicit purpose: survival by any means necessary. The Southern Compact becomes authoritarian almost immediately. When economic collapse threatens social order, strong leaders promising security take power. Democracy becomes negotiable. Within 5 years, the Southern Compact looks less like America and more like authoritarian regimes in other parts of the world. They survive, but at tremendous cost to freedom and human rights. Meanwhile, the original question lingers. What happens to D.C.?
Washington, D.C. isn't a state. It's a federal district that existed solely to house the U.S. government. When the United States dissolves, D.C. becomes the world's strangest situation, a city-state with no economic base, no industry, no agriculture, just monuments and office buildings for a government that no longer exists. Maryland and Virginia immediately claim D.C. Both argue historical precedent. The district was carved from their territories originally. Both need D.C.'s strategic location. Both want to inherit the symbolic capital. But other states object. California claims it should control D.C. as the most populous, wealthy former state. Texas argues the same from its own perspective. New York insists the capital should be neutral international territory. The United Nations gets involved. They propose D.C. becomes an international city like Geneva, neutral territory administered by an international body. Former American states would maintain embassies there.
It would host negotiations, peace talks, and serve as neutral ground. This almost works. Almost. But D.C. itself, now with its own government and 700,000 residents, refuses. They declare independence, the Washington Republic. They claim all federal property within district boundaries, the Capitol, White House, Supreme Court, monuments, museums, and, most importantly, the Library of Congress and National Archives. Those archives contain the original Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and centuries of federal records, legal documents that matter for property claims, treaties, and rights. Every former state wants access. The Washington Republic says, fine, pay us, millions per year for archive access. It works. D.C. becomes a microstate that survives entirely on selling access to American history. They're not powerful, they're not rich, but they're necessary, and necessity is its own form of power. But the bigger question looms: what happens internationally?
The rest of the world doesn't just watch American collapse. They react aggressively. China, as mentioned, takes Taiwan within 2 weeks, but they don't stop there. South China Sea? Chinese lake now. No American fleet to oppose them. They build more artificial islands. They station missiles. They effectively control one of the world's most important shipping lanes. Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines panic. They're suddenly facing expansionist China without American protection. Japan remilitarizes immediately, abandoning its post-WW2 pacifist constitution. They build up forces faster than any nation since 1930s Germany. Within 5 years, Japan has a military that makes neighbors nervous, very nervous. South Korea faces a different nightmare. North Korea, seeing that America won't intervene, invades. The Korean War, frozen since 1953, reignites. Without American forces, South Korea fights alone. China backs the North. The war becomes a brutal stalemate that grinds on for years. Russia swallows the Baltics in a weekend operation. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, gone. NATO meets, argues, and does nothing because the organization's military backbone just dissolved. Russia then moves on Ukraine, which it never fully conquered before. Within months, Ukraine falls. Putin doesn't stop. Moldova, Georgia, former Soviet states fall like dominoes. Russia rebuilds the empire, and Europe can't stop it without America. The Middle East becomes apocalyptic. Iran invades Saudi Arabia. Oil fields burn. Prices hit $400 per barrel. Global economy crashes harder than the Great Depression. Israel, facing existential threat, makes a horrible calculation. They use nuclear weapons. Limited strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. Iran retaliates. Within weeks, you've got nuclear exchange in the Middle East. Millions die. Nuclear winter threatens global agriculture. Fallout spreads across the region. It's the nightmare scenario that American presence prevented for 70 years. Latin America faces its own chaos. Venezuela, Colombia drug wars, Brazilian expansion. With no American influence to moderate conflicts, South America erupts in violence that makes previous decades look peaceful. And all of this happens because the United States, the global hegemon that maintained order, however imperfectly, for 80 years, no longer exists. But here's the darkest part. Even this chaos doesn't convince former American states to reunite.
You'd think after 5 years of warfare, economic collapse, refugee crises, and global chaos, former states would say, let's fix this and reunite. But it doesn't happen. Here's why. First, the successful states don't want to. California's doing fine. They've adapted. They're a major power. Why would they want to bail out Mississippi? Why would they want to share their wealth with failed states again? The Great Lakes Alliance is thriving.
They've built something that works. Reuniting means assuming debt and responsibility for collapsed regions that can't function. From their perspective, it's like asking a successful adult to move back in with toxic family members. The emotional argument exists, but the practical one doesn't. Texas has become an oil empire. They're powerful, wealthy, and independent. Reuniting means giving up sovereignty and profit. Texas oil is selling for premium prices. Why would they want to share that within a unified America where wealth is redistributed? Second, the conflicts have created real hatred. When Arizona and Colorado fought a war over water rights, people died. Families lost sons and daughters fighting other Americans. You don't just forget that. When Texas refused to sell oil to California at reasonable prices, causing blackouts that killed thousands, Californians remember. The Great Lakes states that built walls to keep out refugees from the South. Southerners remember being treated like invaders in their own country. That resentment doesn't disappear. Third, new power structures have formed. Leaders of successful states built their careers on independence. California's president isn't giving up power to become a governor again. Texas leadership isn't abandoning their oil empire to share it with Washington. Bureaucracies have formed, entire new governments with hundreds of thousands of employees. Military officers who achieved high rank in small countries don't want to go back to being colonels in a unified force. Too many people have too much invested in the new system. Fourth, international relations complicate reunion. California has trade agreements with China, Japan, and Pacific nations. Those agreements are valuable. Reuniting means renegotiating everything. China prefers dealing with California alone. They get better terms than they would with a unified America. Texas has oil deals with Europe, Asia, and South America. They're profiting enormously. Reunion disrupts that. Florida's alliance with Cuba has created a profitable Caribbean trade network. Why abandon it? Fifth, identity has shifted. After 5 years, people think of themselves differently. Californians always had strong state identity, but now it's national identity. They're Californians first, former Americans second. Same with Texans, who already had this tendency. A new generation grows up in these countries. Kids who were 5 when America splits are 10 years old now. They've only known independence. To them, the United States is history class, not lived reality. California is their country. Texas is their nation. Reunion requires these kids to suddenly accept they're part of something they never experienced. It doesn't work psychologically. But the biggest reason reunion fails: simple game theory.
Every former state faces a prisoner's dilemma. If everyone cooperates and reunites, everyone benefits. But if most states reunite and a few stay independent, those independent states benefit enormously. California's calculation: if America reunites, California becomes a rich state in a union that includes Mississippi, West Virginia, and other economic disasters. California's wealth gets redistributed. But if California stays independent while others struggle alone, California maintains wealth and power. Every successful state runs this calculation and reaches the same conclusion: staying independent is the dominant strategy. Failed states desperately want reunion because they need it to survive, but they have no leverage. Mississippi can't force California to reunite. Arkansas can't make Texas share oil. This creates a perverse outcome. The states that need reunion can't make it happen, and the states that could make it happen don't need it. There's a brief window, maybe in the first 6 months, where emotional attachment to America might override economic calculation, where people say, "We're Americans, we belong together, let's fix this." But that window closes fast.
The moment California adapts to independence, the moment Texas profits from oil, the moment the Great Lakes Alliance succeeds, reunion becomes economically irrational for them. Some politicians try. There are reunification movements in every state, nostalgic Americans who remember when they were one country, but they're fighting against powerful economic incentives. Think about the European Union. They've tried for decades to create something like the United States. They have free trade, free movement, common currency, but they're not unified. They can't agree on fundamental policies. They can't even keep all members in the Union. Britain left. If Europe, with its centuries of trying to unify, can't make it work, what chance does former America have? Especially former America that's actively hostile toward other regions. The game theory is brutal. Cooperation is optimal for everyone collectively, but defection is optimal for each individual actor. Since you can't force cooperation, you get defection. The United States stays fractured. And that's assuming there's even still something to reunite.
Let's project 30 years forward. 2055. 2 generations have grown up in fractured America. What does the continent look like? California is a major power. Population of 50 million, mostly from immigration and refugees it selectively accepted. It's the world's 3rd largest economy, behind China and the European Union. Silicon Valley expanded into a tech corridor running the entire coast. California has military alliances with Japan, South Korea, and Pacific nations. It's essentially the Pacific power that America used to be. But California is struggling with internal tensions. Northern California wants independence from the South. The state, now country, is so large and diverse that separatist movements are gaining strength. By 2055, there are serious calls for California itself to split into 3 countries. The cycle continues. Texas is the oil empire, but it's peaked. Renewable energy has expanded globally. Oil demand is dropping. Texas's entire economy is based on fossil fuels, and that economy is slowly dying. By 2055, Texas faces the same choice Saudi Arabia faces in our reality: diversify or collapse. Texas tries diversification, but decades of oil wealth created complacency. They're behind in tech, behind in manufacturing, behind in services. The Texas century, as they called it, lasted 30 years. Now they're declining, and they're angry about it. The Great Lakes Alliance is the stable power, not the richest, not the strongest military, but the most functional society. They've maintained democracy, rule of law, and social stability. By 2055, they're the example other regions point to as proof that post-American states can work. But even they have problems. Climate change has shifted weather patterns. The Great Lakes are warming. Invasive species threaten the ecosystem, and they're surrounded by unstable neighbors who envy their stability. Florida is still profiting from geography, but climate change is literally sinking the country. Sea levels have risen significantly by 2055. Miami is partially underwater. The Keys are gone. Florida is spending billions on seawalls and is slowly losing the battle against the ocean. The Southeast Alliance collapsed entirely by 2040. Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia are independent countries, doing moderately well. South Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi are still failed states, now occupied by a UN peacekeeping force trying to maintain basic order. The occupation is unpopular, ineffective, and expensive. The UN wants out, but leaving means these regions descend into complete chaos. It's former Yugoslavia in the American South, and there's no good solution. The Southwest is a disaster. The water wars never really ended. Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico are partially controlled by cartels. Parts of Colorado and Utah maintain order, but border regions are anarchic. The U.S. government once called parts of Mexico ungoverned spaces. Now that describes former American territory. And here's the cruelest irony. By 2055, when climate change is accelerating, when global threats require coordinated response, when humanity needs major powers to lead, former America is too fractured and too hostile to cooperate on anything. There's a moment in 2053 where a Category 6 hurricane, new category created because storms are so much stronger, devastates the Gulf Coast. It hits Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida simultaneously. Millions need help. The disaster requires coordinated response. But Texas and Louisiana are in a trade dispute. Florida is feuding with Alabama over maritime boundaries. Mississippi is a failed state that can't help itself. The response is chaos. International aid helps, but without coordination, recovery is slow and incomplete. 50,000 people die in the storm and its aftermath, deaths that wouldn't have happened if there were a unified government coordinating response. It's the clearest example of what was lost when America split. But even that doesn't lead to reunion. Too much time has passed, too much blood spilled, too much identity changed. The United States, by 2055, is history. It's not coming back.
Here's what keeps historians up at night in this scenario. Was the United States a historical accident? A temporary alignment of circumstances that couldn't last? Think about it. The U.S. stayed unified through a civil war, 2 world wars, a Cold War, civil rights struggles, and countless internal tensions. It survived because of shared identity, economic integration, and institutional strength. But maybe those were always fragile. Maybe the forces pushing toward fragmentation were always stronger than the forces holding it together. Maybe we just got lucky for 250 years. European history suggests nations aren't permanent. Yugoslavia existed for decades before fracturing violently. The Soviet Union seemed eternal until it wasn't. The Habsburg Empire ruled Central Europe for centuries, then disappeared in a few years. Maybe large, diverse federations are inherently unstable. Maybe the natural state of humanity is smaller political units. Maybe the United States was always going to fracture, we just don't know when. This is the uncomfortable question. If the United States split into 50 countries, would it ever reunite? History suggests no. Once nations fracture, they stay fractured. People adjust, new identities form, reunion becomes impossible. Germany reunified, but only after 40 years and only because of unique circumstances, Cold War ending, Soviet collapse, strong international support. And Germany was 2 countries, not 50. 50 independent states have 50 different interests. Getting 50 nations to agree on reunion is exponentially harder than getting 2 to agree. The complexity makes it effectively impossible. So if America fractured, it would likely be permanent. That's the terrifying implication. The United States could end not with a bang, but with a gradual fracture that becomes irreversible.
But here's what this entire thought experiment reveals. The United States isn't held together by borders, military force, or government mandate. It's held together by choice. Every day, Americans choose to be part of this union. States choose to stay. It's voluntary. And that choice is based on something crucial. The union provides value. Economic integration benefits everyone. Free movement means opportunity. Common currency facilitates trade. Shared military provides security. Federal government, however imperfect, coordinates response to crises. The moment that value disappears, the moment states perceive they'd be better off alone, the union is at risk. The United States isn't invincible. It's maintained by the belief that we're better together than apart. That belief has to be reinforced constantly. It's reinforced by economic policy that doesn't leave regions behind, by political systems that give everyone voice, by cultural recognition that diversity is strength, by infrastructure that literally connects the country. The scenario we explored, 50 independent states, shows what happens when that belief dies. When regions decide they're better off alone, when economic integration unravels, when shared identity fractures. It's not just theoretical. We've seen echoes of this throughout history: secessionist movements, regional tensions, political polarization, times when the Union felt fragile. What prevented fracture? Sometimes military force, the Civil War. Sometimes economic necessity, the Great Depression created need for federal action. Sometimes external threats, world wars unified the country against common enemies. But ultimately, what's always held America together is the active choice by Americans to maintain the Union. That choice isn't guaranteed. It's not permanent. It requires work. Every generation has to reaffirm commitment to the Union, has to find new reasons to stay together, has to navigate tensions and conflicts without fracturing, has to remember that the alternative to imperfect union is catastrophic fragmentation.
This thought experiment isn't really about what would happen if America split. It's about why America must not split. The global chaos, the economic collapse, the warfare, the human suffering, the failed states, the refugee crises, the nuclear exchanges, all of it preventable by maintaining the Union. But maintaining the Union requires more than inertia. It requires active work. It requires addressing regional inequalities so no state feels exploited. It requires political systems that give everyone voice so no region feels unheard. It requires economic policies that spread prosperity so no state feels left behind. It requires Americans in California to care about Americans in Mississippi, Texans to recognize their fate is tied to New Yorkers, Midwesterners to understand that coastal prosperity affects them, everyone to recognize that we're connected, interdependent, and stronger together. This isn't just patriotic sentiment, it's practical reality. The modern world requires large-scale coordination. Climate change doesn't respect state borders. Pandemics don't stop at state lines. Economic crises affect everyone. Security threats require unified response. Small nations can survive, but they can't lead. They can't solve.